Thank you. And before we move to the first question, could I invite the First Minister to make a few remarks following the tragic events in Christchurch in New Zealand?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I do want to begin today with heartfelt condolences to the people of New Zealand after last week's appalling terrorist attack in Christchurch. I hope that people in New Zealand can take some comfort from the knowledge that people across the world stand in solidarity with them. Events in New Zealand have been felt deeply here in Scotland as in other countries, and perhaps especially in our Muslim community. Last week, Police Scotland arranged reassurance patrols and visits to mosques and to other places of worship. I visited Glasgow Central Mosque on Friday with the Justice Secretary. The Prime Minister of New Zealand has said that nations around the world are now engaged in a global fight against far-right, racist and extremist ideology. Regrettably, she is absolutely right. All of us have a responsibility to engage in that fight. We must tackle hatred and prejudice through the words that we use, the actions that we take and the climate that we create. And I know that all parties in this chamber will play their part in doing that. Presiding Officer, in the last week, we have also seen an attack in Utrecht and the stabbing of a teenager in Surrey. And our condolences are with all of those affected by those incidents as well. Let us today express sympathy and solidarity with the victims of racist and extremist violence in Christchurch and around the world. And above all, let us make clear our determination that the proponents of hate will be defeated by the values of kindness, compassion and love.
Thank you. We turn now to our questions. The first turn to question 3, Patrick Harvey.
On behalf of the Scottish Greens, can I join with others in expressing our shared concern for the bereaved and the injured following the far-right terrorist attack in New Zealand, but also our respect for the response that country is showing, recommitting to the values of their inclusive society and refusing to placate the far right as far too many politicians around the world have done. Presiding Officer, last night, in the midst of a crisis of our own making, the Prime Minister again refused to listen to reason and instead effectively told the public that Parliament is their enemy. Scotland needs the freedom to take a different direction, leave behind this chaos and find our own way out of the crisis. It's why we need our independence. The First Minister told us that she would say something about her preferred timing within weeks. That was 2 months ago. So can I ask again, when?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, can I agree with Patrick Harvey that the Prime Minister's comments last night were deeply irresponsible, and I hope that in time she will reflect on that. But her comments also failed to accept any of the responsibility she bears for the mess that the UK is in right now. She wanted to blame everybody except herself, and yet I think most people know that it was the Prime Minister who triggered Article 50 without a plan. It was the Prime Minister who drew self-defeating, contradictory lead lines that boxed her in from the start. It was the Prime Minister who called an unnecessary general election, who delayed the first vote on her deal in an attempt to run down the clock. It was the Prime Minister who failed to listen and change course after the first defeat of her deal and then again after the second. She must change course now before it is too late, and she must bear responsibility for the mess this country is in. On the issue of independence, the frustration people feel right now at our country, Scotland's future, being determined by the DUP and a cabal of right-wing Tories is understandable, and I absolutely share it. I said I'd wait until the end of this phase of the Brexit negotiations before setting out my views on the way forward for Scotland. Having done so this long, I think it is reasonable to wait to see what clarity emerges in the next few days, even if I suspect that will just be clarity that there will be no clarity. And then I will set out my views on the path forward. But there is no doubt, nobody can be in any doubt that change is needed. The last 3 years have shown that the status quo is broken. It cannot protect Scotland from the folly of Brexit and all that flows from that. Even the most ardent unionist must see that the way we are governed now by Westminster is broken. The question is, how do we fix that for the future? And there's no doubt in my mind that letting people in Scotland choose an independent future is the best way to do that.
Patrick Harvey.
At every stage of this nightmare, this Parliament has tried to persuade the Prime Minister to change course. We've called for the narrow 2016 result and Scotland's Remain vote to be respected. We've called for our place in the single market to be protected. We've called for the public to have the right of a final say and the chance to cancel this crisis. If the Prime Minister succeeds in closing off all of these positive choices and the country finds itself being driven to the edge of the cliff next week, this time next week, if that happens, does the First Minister agree that MPs must be prepared finally to put the public interest first and be willing, if all else fails, to do what's necessary and revoke Article 50?
The briefer, First Minister.
Yes, and indeed the SNP at Westminster and the Greens and the Liberal Democrats and Plaid Cymru issued a joint statement last night to that effect. SNP MPs will not vote for the Prime Minister's deal because it is a bad deal that will damage Scottish interests, and I don't think any Scottish MP should vote for such a deal. But nor will we accept her framing that it is a choice between her deal and no deal. Just because she's not willing to contemplate the alternatives doesn't mean that there aren't any alternatives. One of those alternatives, undoubtedly, is the revocation of Article 50. And if all else fails by this time next week, that is exactly, in my view, what MPs should do.
Question for Willie Rennie.
Can I associate myself and my party with the remarks of the First Minister about New Zealand? The events in that country were truly sickening. You wouldn't think that we were in the middle of a national crisis if you just listened to the questions from the leaders of the Conservative and Labour parties. But I have to say the last thing this country needs is more division and chaos with independence to compound the division and chaos of Brexit. The first duty of a Prime Minister is to keep the country safe. Yet because of the cavalier choices of this Prime Minister, emergency measures under Operation Yellowhammer have been triggered. Medicines, food supply chains, transport, all at risk. Does the First Minister agree with me that no serious Prime Minister should ever threaten such catastrophic consequences, no matter how much she wants her policy to pass?
First Minister.
Well, before I address that, can I just say to the first part of Willie Rennie's question there, the inconsistency in Willie Rennie's position is this. He wants people across the UK to have the ability to escape Brexit through a second referendum, and I agree with him on that. But if that doesn't prove to be possible, he thinks that Scotland should just grin and bear it and put up with the devastation of Brexit, instead of Scotland having the choice to escape Brexit and have an independent future. That is a deeply inconsistent position for him to take, and I hope he'll reflect on it. On the issue of Yellowhammer, which of course is the emergency planning for a no-deal Brexit, I do think it is beyond comprehension that any Prime Minister could be knowingly allowing the country to be 8 days, now round about 200 hours away from that possibility of crashing out of the EU without a deal and requiring that emergency planning work to be done. I, yesterday, as I have done once a week for several weeks now, chaired a meeting of the Scottish Government's Resilience Committee looking at medicines supplies, food supplies, transport links in the event of a no-deal Brexit. It is outrageous that we are having to expend time, energy and resources in doing so. The Prime Minister really must, before any more time passes and before it is too late, change course, take no deal off the table completely, look at building a broader consensus rather than pandering to the hardliners in our own party, and if necessary, dumping Brexit completely. That would be in the best interest of the country.
Willie Rennie.
The First Minister is wrong. The inconsistency is that to believe that breaking up An economic partnership of 40 years will be chaotic, but breaking up one of 300 years will be a piece of cake.
Order, please.
She is the inconsistent one. People are scunnered by this agonising Brexit process. 3 years on, 200 hours left. Isn't it time for a common-sense approach? Common sense where we have a Prime Minister who takes a no-deal Brexit off the table instead of using it as a threat against her own citizens. Where party leaders, all party leaders, can sit down and talk without the leader of the opposition walking out because he doesn't like Chuka Amuna. Where the Prime Minister reaches out to MPs in Parliament rather than insulting them from behind a podium in number 10. Common sense, where we admit that Parliament is incapable of deciding, so we have a public vote to let the people decide. Isn't it time for that common sense approach?
First Minister.
Yes, I agree with all of that. I think people across the UK should have the opportunity to vote again, given everything they now know that wasn't known in 2016, which is why I'll be calling for that in London on Saturday, with many others, no doubt hundreds of thousands of others in London. And I agree with everything he said about the Prime Minister. I agree with him in his despair about the leader of the Labour Party and his childish behaviour last night, when what we need to see is people coming together to find an alternative. Where I disagree with him is in his view that if all of what he has just called for fails, then Scotland should just be powerless in the face of the disaster of Brexit. I oppose Brexit as he does, but there was nothing inevitable about the chaos of Brexit. That was down to those who proposed it having no idea what it looked like in reality and doing no planning for it. It did not have to be that way. And again, I would say to Willie Rennie, the inconsistency is him standing up here rightly, spelling out the disaster that Brexit will be, but then saying, if all else fails, Scotland just has to put up with it. Well, I don't think Scotland has to put up with it, and I don't think Scotland should have to put up with it. If it comes to it, Scotland choosing independence is a much brighter future than remaining part of Brexit Britain.
We have some additional supplementaries. The first from Jenny Gilruth, to be followed by Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Prime Minister last night claimed that the public have had enough. Today, a petition on the UK Parliament website calling for Article 50 to be revoked is already well on the way to 1 million signatures. Support is growing so fast that the website crashed harder than the Prime Minister's credibility. Isn't it the case that if the Prime Minister believes that she has the people with her, she should have the courage to put that to the test and call for a people's vote?
First Minister.
Yes, I do. As I said, I thought the Prime Minister's statement last night was deeply regrettable. I think for her to be blaming everybody except herself beggars belief. And now is the time, I think, for people across parties to speak out. I mean, I watched last night one of the most powerful contributions that I've ever seen in the House of Commons. Dominic Grieve, a moderate Tory, I think everybody would accept, an honourable person, having the honesty to say that he was ashamed to be in the Conservative Party, and the conduct of the Prime Minister made him want to weep. And yet we hear Scottish Conservatives continue to parrot the lines of the Prime Minister. And I often wonder if Jackson Carlaw ever, in his quieter moments, thinks that it might be better for the country, indeed for his own reputation, for him to actually say what I believe he probably thinks, that this is a mess. Carrying on regardless is a profound mistake. The Prime Minister must change course, and she must do so now before it's too late.
Daniel Johnson.